Today we have Dr. Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. Dr. Khalidi received his BA from Yale in 1970 and his doctorate from Oxford in 1974. He is the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and was the president of the Middle East Studies Association, and an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October of 1991 to June of 1993. Additionally, he has written several books focused on the subject of Palestine, including his most recent work, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Hello, Doctor, and thank you for joining us here today. Afi and I are just so excited to have you with us. We have recently both visited Israel and Palestine and have so many questions to ask. So thank you again for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we'll begin. For our listeners who may not have heard about you or the work that you've done, can you please explain to us how and why you became so involved in the Palestinian movement and studies?
Well, I'm Palestinian by origin, and my family was involved in it from back in the day. I talk about some of these things in the book, actually, involvement of members of my family at different stages of the modern history of Palestine. And I also was brought up in a household where Palestine was always being discussed. My dad worked for the United Nations. He worked as a member of the Secretariat, and he was in Political and Security Council Affairs Division, dealing with the Middle East. So the Middle East was a topic, Palestine was a topic of conversation all the time in my family. We traveled to the Middle East all the time. We have family in the Middle East. And I lived in Beirut and in other parts of the Middle East for about half of my life. So it was something that I grew up with and something that, was, I suppose you'd say, part of me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How much would you say that familial influence guides your work and your research today?
Well, especially in the book that you just mentioned, the 100 Years' War on Palestine. I actually decided to use my own personal experiences of members of my family to flesh out and make more direct and more understandable aspects of the history that I dealt with in a sort of dry, objective, historical fashion. And so this is in terms of previous work I've done, this is a complete departure where I talk about things that my grandfather or my uncles and aunts or other members of the family did or said or told me. I would never have done this before in any of my work.
Wow. Well, thank you. It's a fantastic book. But to get to the brass tacks of the subject, there are many listeners today who don't understand or grasp the situation that's happening in Israel and Palestine, and therefore the work that you've done so much research on. Can you shed some light on that for those of our listeners that might be unaware?
Sure. And I think a lot of people do begin with misconceptions. One of them being that this is in some way a conflict between equals, that you have these two peoples, they're more or less the same. It's like the French and the Germans. I mean, that's in some senses the best way of misunderstanding it. There are worse ways. These are fanatical anti-Semites who just hate Jews because Arabs always have hated Jews, or some ridiculous version of this conflict has been going on for millennia, none of which, of course, is true. Even the version which argues that this is just a conflict between two peoples on a basis of equality is fundamentally false in at least one respect. Yes, there are two peoples, but no, there is not now and never was a relationship of equality between them. One always had the big battalions on its side, which is to say the Zionist movement and the state of Israel always had the greatest power of the age, in some case fighting for it. Israel is not established in 1948. Israel established before that by the British crushing the Palestinians militarily in order to make possible what later happens with the actual establishment of the state in 1948. And so one of the things that I try and show in this book, and the reason I call it the 100 Years' War on Palestine, is that the Palestinians were at the receiving end, not just of what the Zionist movement was trying to do and later the state of Israel did, but of what British imperial power and later Britain and France as imperial powers in the Middle East, or the United States and the Soviet Union did to the Palestinians. It wasn't innocent, and it wasn't on their part, and it wasn't impartial. The British constructed a fairy tale about how they tried to balance between the two sides. They never did any such thing. The British helped to implant the Zionist project, suppressed the Palestinians, brought in 100,000 troops when they revolted in the 30s and crushed their revolt, killing, wounding, exiling, or imprisoning something like 17% of the adult male Arab population of the country. That's not even-handed.
Mhm.
That is breaking the back of Palestinian resistance in order to implant the Zionist project. So I argue in this book against that idea that, oh, they're more or less on a basis of equality. I make other arguments along those lines, but I think that that's one of the key takeaways I would like people to end with if they have a chance to look at this book.
Yeah, thank you. That the book which I have here, which I recently read, it is a fantastic book for anyone looking to learn more on the subject. In the book, The 100 Years War in Palestine, you kind of just answered that, but you talk about how thoroughly Israel has been able to control the storyline of events in the Middle East over the past century, and as you just discussed, with influence of other nations that they've kind of brought into it. Did you want to elaborate any more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the revelation in this came in two ways. It came in terms of growing up largely in New York City, and understanding how stacked against the Palestinians the narrative is. The only narrative in most people's minds is either a biblical narrative or the New York Times / Abba Eban narrative. In other words, stuff they heard from Israelis or from American friends of Israel, in every possible medium and from every politician over 6 or 7 generations, going back to Woodrow Wilson through Truman and right up to the present. So, I mean, I knew that from, going to public school in Mount Vernon, from going to other schools in New York City, from, my experiences as a kid and as a young person. But I understood it most clearly from something that Edward Said said, the person for whom the chair that I have the honor to, have said in one of his articles, in which he said, before they won things on the battlefield, before they established the institutions that made the Zionist project successful, the Zionists were fighting and winning a discursive battle, a battle over narratives. And this is something that they always understood, but I don't think Palestinians and Arabs and their friends and most other people have understood, that this was a battle that was long ago waged in order to establish a certain version of reality, which today is almost sacrosanct for some people, and which in many of its important elements is completely false. Made the desert bloom. I could go on and on and on. But there are tropes there. Israel was in danger of annihilation in 1967. There are multiple really crucial elements of how people think they know what's going on in Palestine and in Israel, which are fundamentally false, but which have been pounded into them. They're now facts. I mean, you argue with people of a certain generation and you will get nowhere. They know, and there's no way of dissuading them from looking down with condescension at anyone who even attempts to challenge those verities.
Thank you, Dr. Khalidi, and thank you, Aaron. So, is the West Bank really an occupied or disputed territory in your opinion?
Yeah, there is again an utterly false narrative, which argues on the part of Israel and a very few of its friends that the occupied territories are not actually occupied. They are, of course, occupied territories in international law, as far as the United Nations is concerned. As far as the American policy, up until this perverted administration that fortunately is about to leave office soon, American policy always understood and recognized that the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip even, which is still under Israeli control, even though Israel withdrew its forces from it, are all occupied territories, as is the Syrian Golan Heights. They are occupied territories, even though Israel disputes that universal assessment. So it's only disputed in the minds of Israelis or official Israelis.
It's interesting that Israel is in fact recognized as a Jewish nation, even though you see Islamic quarters, Armenian quarters. And furthermore, during my trip there, I've observed that Bethlehem, which is now Palestine, becomes so lively during Christmas Eve. Especially considering the boundary changes, it's interesting to see that. Can you describe the relations between the various religions and ethnicities in such a small yet unstable space?
Right. That's a big question, Afia. Well, the first thing to say is that you're right. Israel does describe itself as a Jewish state. In fact, the Israeli Knesset passed what was called, I think, the Jewish nation state law in 2018, in which it said that in Israel, only one people is entitled to the right of national self-determination. There's only one people, one nation, the Jewish people. And what they thereby did was to deny that the state could in any way represent the almost 20% of the citizens of that state who are not Jewish, let's say who are Arab. So you have an inherent problem in a state's citizens not being nationals of a state which is declared, to have only one set of nationals, i.e., people who are members of the Jewish people. And that's a contradiction that Israelis have to wrestle with. And one wishes that people would understand what that means. It would mean, imagine 20% of Americans are not Americans in a certain sense. This is a country only for them. I mean, if you were to argue this is a country for white people, and non-whites are not nationals in a certain sense. They have the passport. You can vote. But you are fundamentally discriminated against in terms of that basic marker of identity. Before nationalism, before, in other words, Zionism and Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism, the relationships between different religious groups in Palestine were reasonably good. You did not have pogroms. You did not have massacres. You did not have. You had some friction. You had some tension, obviously. But you also had a lot of interaction and a lot of intermarriage. I mean, most of the people I know, my wife's family, my family, we have people, there are people who are intermarried, not just Muslims and Christians, but Muslims and Jews or Christians and Jews. I mean, it happened in the 19th century. It happened in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. That changes with the rise of political Zionism and with the rise of Arab nationalism. But that's not an eternal feature of Palestine. They were not always trying to kill each other. In fact, there was no such tension whatsoever in the 18th or the 17th or the 16th centuries, going back, for literally a millennium or more.
What was the political reason or strategy behind Israel's move of really maintaining a full blockade in Gaza, especially 2005 onwards?
Well, the claim is that this is for security reasons. But if you look very carefully, Israel justifies a lot of things, including reducing the caloric intake of Gazans on the basis of security. I mean, these are in terms of international humanitarian law, some of these things are probably war crimes, and they're not justifiable on any basis. But Israel covers a multitude of sins with the security argument, and it is true. There have been Israeli casualties as a result of rocket fire or other hostile action from the Gaza Strip, but Gaza is under occupation with entry and exit completely controlled by Israel. And not just of people, of goods. So their exports, their imports, their ability to eat or whatever, to have hospital supplies in a situation where COVID is rampant is entirely dependent on Israel. One, which is an illegal and inhuman and immoral situation. And two, if one were to look at the balance of terror between Gaza with its rockets or whatever, and Israel with the biggest arsenal in the Middle East, you will see a casualty ratio of 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 or 18 to 1. I mean, a half dozen Israelis are killed in one so-called war. It's really a war on Gaza. 2,000 Gazans are killed or wounded. So we are not talking about, quote unquote, the terror justifying these things. There are multiple ways to deal with violence and starving people or restricting their access to medical supplies or fuel or electricity or whatever it may be is actually an inhuman punishment of a population for whatever sins that its leadership may be adjudged to have committed.
So in the current scenario, how do these Israeli settlements really impact the peace process?
Yeah, well, this is really very, very important. Israel and its advocates abroad downplay the importance of settlements. But I think you have to, I mean, one of the things I try and argue in the book is that in one aspect, Zionism is a settler colonial project. It was viewed as such by generations of early Zionists. This is not, some nasty post-colonial label attached to Israel. This is a the self-perception of European Jews coming to Palestine, understanding that they have a claim and that feeling that it's their country, but understanding that they are European settlers who are colonizing. And so, one of the major purchasing agencies for land was the Jewish Colonization Agency. That's not some slur on early Zionism. That's their description of what they were doing. And that process has continued in the occupied territories. The process of taking land, allocating to Jews only or barring Palestinians from it, and then turning it into Jewish-only settlements, which are sited in such a way as to prevent any contiguity between Palestinian population concentrations. This is a process that has been going on at different levels at different speeds, really since 1967 in the occupied West Bank and also in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. And of course, it's an obstacle to peace, depending on what kind of peace you're talking about. If you're talking about a peace which is Israel imposing its will and all of Palestine being transformed into the land of Israel, which is what the Trump administration and the current Israeli government are doing, or were trying to do in the case of Trump, then of course it's an imposed peace in which the Palestinians will take what they can get, which is to live in little Bantustans between vast areas controlled exclusively for Jews, with highways only for Israeli Jews, and so on and so forth. But if you're talking about some kind of just, equitable resolution, whether two states, a Palestinian state side by side with Israel, or one state with equal rights for everybody, then this is obviously not compatible with peace or with justice or with equity.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Continuing on, kind of just on what you were going off, actually, as Israel moves deeper into the West Bank in an attempt to allegedly secure the rights of the Jewish community, how do you believe that Palestinians will react in the future?
Well, I mean, history always surprises you. Nobody expected the Great Revolt of 1936 to break out when it did. Nobody expected the First Intifada of 1987 to break out when it did. Things happen. So I can't predict. I've been burned too many times. And also I always say the job description of a historian doesn't include the predicting the future. So I'm not going to predict. I don't know how they will run. But, the kind of pressure that Israel puts on the Palestinians has to find an outlet somewhere. How that pressure will be released, in what way, I don't know. But the Israelis have microdosed the pressure. They've become sadistically scientific in the way in which they squeeze the Palestinians, stealing a little bit of land here, establishing a new settlement there, establishing restrictions, expelling people, demolishing homes, arresting minors, the things that they do and have done systematically since the occupation began in 1967. And there have been times when nobody was expecting it and there was some kind of reaction from the Palestinians. I don't know, but you cannot squeeze people the way that they are being squeezed. You cannot put the kind of, you both have been there, so you've seen what I'm talking about. Many other people who go to Israel are given what I would call a magical mystery tour, where they're shown everything except the real reality of what's happening in Palestine to the Palestinians. And it's very easy to do that. There are bypass roads whereby you can whiz by Palestinian communities and never see them. You can drive up the main highway from the north to the south, and there's a big wall to the right. You don't see Palestinians behind that wall. And so, if you see it, you understand the extent to which this is constant pressure. It will find an outlet. How and when, I couldn't possibly say.
The Israeli occupation of the West Bank is all-consuming for Palestinians who live there, constrained by Israeli checkpoints, just in reference to the wall that you were just discussing. I was wondering if you could touch upon that for those in our audience who do not know how much this issue affects the day-to-day lives of countless Palestinians.
Right. Well, I mean, imagine living in a metropolitan area like Jerusalem. And imagine that you're a citizen of Israel and you can go anywhere you want on brand new, fabulous roads that take you west, east, north, south in literally minutes, assuming traffic is not so bad. And then assume you have a different identity card. And to go from point A to point B, to cross the Hudson River, I'm sitting in Manhattan, to cross the Hudson River, or to go from the east side to the west side, you have to take a 2-hour detour. and be stopped at a checkpoint where you have to go through iron gates and be interrogated and so on and so forth. The process that in the rush hour can take hours. All of this within a metropolitan area. We're not talking, going from Kansas to California. We are talking about crossing town. And for Group A, that is a seamless, easy, quick process. For Group B, it's hours because of these kinds of checkpoints. And that's true between cities and towns. You want to go from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, you're Israeli, you can go very quickly. You won't go to Bethlehem, you'll go to the settlements that ring Bethlehem from Jerusalem or anywhere else to the north. It'll take you 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, whatever. If you're Palestinian, it'll take you hours. And that is the reality everybody faces. I mean, my brother lives in Ramallah. He has an American passport. He has Israeli residence. He has a wife who is an Israeli citizen. He can do things that other Palestinians can't do, and there are things he can't do that Israelis can do. And I mean, he comes from a family that has lived in Palestine for centuries and centuries and centuries, and he has diminished rights compared to, Joe Blow arrives off the plane from Brooklyn, gets an Israeli passport, and dude is good to go, can go anywhere immediately without any restrictions whatsoever. So this is a fundamentally discriminatory. I mean, it's like South African pass laws and worse. It's like Jim Crow and worse. And it's been refined and systematized in a way that it works perfectly efficiently for Israelis and inflicts untold suffering on Palestinians. Almost all of them, a very, very few who have VIP passports, the biggest business people, the officials of the Palestinian Authority, which is almost like a subcontractor for the Israeli government. A few of those people don't suffer these indignities, but everybody else does. And I should say, the last thing is for Gazans, they can't get out anywhere at all. The most heavily populated area on earth, the overwhelming majority of Gazans born since in the last decade or two have never been able to leave Gaza.
Right.
It's the largest, in a sense, it's the largest, prison camp on earth.
Right. Right. And this next question actually kind of touches upon what you just addressed, but continuing to speak about the current state of the day-to-day life in the region, especially for Palestinians. During my recent visit to Israel and Palestine, I couldn't help but notice a strong level of inequality between the two states, as you just mentioned and touched upon again. How do you feel that this conflict continues to impact the economy and unemployment in either area?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Israel has done has been to sort of slice and dice Palestinian communities. So some groups have certain access and certain privileges that others don't. There are 1.8 million, a little more now, closer to 2 million Palestinians who live as citizens of the state of Israel inside Israel. Those people have advantages that other Palestinians don't. They're discriminated against in certain ways. They're not eligible for certain things. There are laws that prevent them. They're not allowed to live in Jewish communities, for one thing. So, the kind of rank legalized discrimination, which was existed in the United States of segregation, of absolute segregation, operates within Israel. There are no mixed communities. Where there are cities, the Arabs live in one place, for example, Haifa or Jaffa, inside Israel. The Arabs live in one place, the Jews live in another place. They go to separate schools. There are separate school systems. There's Arab schools and there are Jewish schools. Nevertheless, those people have access to certain rights and to certain jobs and so on and so forth that Palestinians in the occupied territories can only dream of. A second category is Palestinian citizens of Jerusalem who have Israeli residence, but most of them don't have Israeli citizenship. They have rights that other Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza don't have. The place where the impact in terms of unemployment is the greatest is, of course, Gaza, where unemployment is in the 30s to 40% range. Always, youth unemployment is even higher. And unemployment for women is even higher. So you have, in Gaza, an extraordinary immiseration of the population, partly due to the blockade, the Israeli and Egyptian, it should be added, blockade. Egypt controls the Rafah checkpoint. Israel controls the checkpoints into Israel. And between them, in collaboration with one another, they have imposed a blockade on Gaza, which has caused this economic situation. It wasn't that bad before the blockade began 16 years ago, 14 years ago. By any means, unemployment was higher in Gaza than it was in the West Bank, but nothing like the levels in the last 15 years. And in the West Bank, you have something in between the situation in Israel. High unemployment, but nowhere near as high as in Gaza, but much higher than unemployment of Palestinians inside Israel. And you have levels of immiseration which differ from place to place. I mean, the city of Ramallah is a zone of prosperity by comparison with some other parts of the West Bank. Why? Because there are international agencies there. Why? Because it's the seat of the Palestinian Authority, and so there are a lot of salaries. And because it's a sort of a bubble, it's a sort of a green zone in the occupied territories. You go 20 kilometers north or south of Ramallah, and you find a different situation. Other cities, for example, are nowhere near as prosperous. And towns and villages, in many cases, are much, much worse off. So it differs from place to place and group to group.
Yes, when I recently went to Palestine, I noticed that difference in Ramallah versus the neighboring villages. I spent some time trying to explore, so I had a better eye view on that. So I know exactly what you mean, and it's a very good point. Okay, I also wanted to touch upon Palestine's position with the UN and the representation of Palestine, both the lack thereof and the UN's position on crimes committed against Palestine. Could you explain this a little bit more to our listeners?
Right. I mean, firstly, one of the things that should be said, I'm very critical of different leaderships of the Palestinian national movement in my book, in the 100 Years' War on Palestine, including the leadership of the PLO. But one of their successes was a real breakthrough in terms of Palestinian representation in the 1970s, getting Palestine's voice heard at the United Nations, getting Palestinians a seat at the table in negotiations. In my view, especially as a result of the Oslo Accords, those negotiations came to nothing. But Palestine and Palestinians and a Palestinian voice had been systematically excluded at every previous stage of almost every negotiation. There were a couple of exceptions, but this was a great achievement for the Palestinians. That Yasser Arafat addressed the UN General Assembly in 1974. That embassies for Palestine were opened in dozens and dozens and dozens, over 100 countries around the world, and that Palestine got observer status at the United Nations. However, it's not a member state of the United Nations because it's not a sovereign state. Now, some people are arguing it should be treated as a sovereign state, that the United Nations General Assembly in 1947 called for an Arab state to be created in Palestine. The PLO in 1988 accepted that as a basis for a two-state solution. But there has been systematic obstruction of the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state by both Israel and the United States. And that's one of the points that I make in this book. The United States and Israel have never really offered independence and sovereignty. Or I should say, Israel has never offered, the United States has never really endorsed. What anybody who understands what statehood and sovereignty means is real, full, independent statehood and sovereignty and self-determination. Every offer that Israel has made has been hedged around with limitations, which in fact mean that this would not have been a sovereign state. Israel has to keep control of the eastern border. Israel has to keep control of whether people come into the state. Israel has to keep control of the airspace. Israel has to keep control of the land. Israel has to keep control of water resources, and so on and so forth. That's not sovereignty. That's not statehood. Indian reservations, Bantustans, you can call them what you want. They're not sovereign. That's not a sovereign state. And so whatever the reason is, Palestine has not yet achieved that kind of status at the United Nations. However, it did achieve the ability to at least voice the Palestinian position in an international forum.
Right. Thank you. Let's talk about a more touchy issue here. Hamas is a Palestinian militant group formed in 1987, and it openly seeks the destruction of Israel. Israeli forces have periodically attacked them. What positive or negative impact does Hamas actually have in the overall fight for Palestine?
Right. Well, Hamas won elections in 2006. And those elections were premised on their joining into the Palestinian Authority, which in turn is premised on peace with Israel. And Hamas leaders for 15, 20 years have now been saying, we accept the long-term truce with Israel, we accept the idea we'll stop armed struggle and so on. Israel has not only rejected that, Israel has succeeded. This is part of this narrative discursive victory. Hamas is a terrorist group. Israel kills 10 times as many Palestinians. Israel is not terrorist. Hamas is terrorist. Israel kills 10 times as many Palestinian civilians as Hamas kills Israeli civilians, but it's only Hamas that's terrorist. Israel has extirpated Palestine. Israel is in the process of replacing Palestine with the land of Israel, but it's Hamas that wants to destroy the state of Israel. Israel has destroyed Palestine. It's not that they want to or they say it. They're not so stupid as to say, we will destroy Palestine. They are doing it. They have done it. But they do it without saying so. The nation state law passed in 2018 basically says there's one people here, nobody exists except us as a people. That's destruction of Palestine. That's the act. They've done it. They're doing, and they've now legalized it. But we don't get a version of Israel is destroying or has destroyed or wants to destroy Palestine. What we get is Hamas wants to destroy Israel. Now you have these, as I've said, Hamas leaders who, over a generation now almost, have been very explicit in saying we want a 100-year truce with Israel. Well, after 100 years, who knows what's going to happen? And moreover, they do accept the idea of a two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Israel would much prefer to have Hamas as a bogeyman, which it can treat as it has treated it, than accepting the idea that the Palestinians reconcile with one another, that they come up with a negotiating, they're strengthened, they come up with a negotiating position, which is tougher than the one of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah today, but which would involve negotiating for a two-state solution. Israel doesn't want that. They don't want the Palestinians to appear moderate. And Hamas doesn't do itself any favors, frankly. They keep talking about resistance, and they do keep firing rockets. And Israel uses that as a pretext for continuing the blockade, justifying it on the basis of security. So children can't get medicines because of security. Electricity can only operate 4 hours a day because of security. There are not enough ventilators for the COVID patients in the Gaza Strip because of security. And Israel still retains overwhelming military superiority. I mean, it fires. In the book, I talk about the weight, the tonnage of bombs that landed in Gaza and rockets and shells that landed in Gaza in 2014 compared to what Hamas fired. Hamas fired hundreds, maybe more, rockets during that conflict. But the imbalance was extraordinary, and the casualty told themselves. Many Israelis were killed, most of them soldiers inside Gaza, engaged in attacking Hamas, and a few civilians, and thousands, a little over 2,000 people, most of them civilians, are killed and wounded in that 2014 war on Gaza. So Hamas has been demonized in the sense that it refuses to give up armed struggle. It can be argued that there's some reason for that demonization. But it should be said, while it's true that any attack on civilians, a purposeful attack, certainly on civilians, or attack in which civilians are killed, can rise to the level of war crimes. And many international bodies have said that Hamas is guilty of those things. The same thing is also true of Israel. But somehow nation-state actors that carry out what should be at least considered as potential war crimes get away with it, and non-state actors are hammered with sanctions, put on the terrorist list, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you look at the casualty totals between Palestinians and Israelis over however many decades you want to go back, we're talking about infinitely more Palestinian civilians being killed, but the Palestinians than Israelis, and the Palestinians come away with the label of terrorists.
So, right-wing extremists have been a significant force in Israeli politics, which has caused the murder of Mohammed Abu Khader. What are your thoughts on violence against the Arabs in the region?
Yeah, well, I've already said something about that in terms of state violence. The Abu Khader case raises the issue of settler violence, which is to say, the violence carried out by Israeli state-supported settlers on stolen Palestinian land, attacking Palestinians, which is a common occurrence. The attacks are not always fatal. Sometimes there are attacks on Palestinian property, the cutting down of 100-year-old olive trees by the hundreds, or preventing Palestinians from harvesting their crops, or cutting off water sources to Palestinians, preventing them from accessing water, and so on and so forth. And sometimes stoning of cars, the torching of homes, beating or stoning of civilians. And all of this takes place with complete impunity. Settlers, in the case of, in this case that you mentioned, the Abu Khader case, there actually have been convictions. But in most of these cases, there's not even an investigation. And if there is, there's no follow-up. And if there is, there's no conviction. And if there's a conviction, it's a slap on the wrist. Whereas Palestinians who throw stones will go to jail for years. Whereas Israelis who do the same thing usually don't have any sanction. So you have state-supported settler violence, or violence by state-supported settlers, which is part of the pressure put on the Palestinians. And that is a function of the incredible power that the settler lobby has developed within Israel. I was on a similar webinar with Israeli journalist for the Haaretz newspaper, Gideon Levy, and he was talking about the immense power that the settler lobby has in Israeli politics. I mean, you have multiple ministers and perhaps dozens of Knesset members, certainly many, I don't know how many, who live in illegal Israeli settlements on stolen Palestinian land. And so these are not people who are operating from outside the system. These are people who are running the system, people in government, people in cabinet positions, who are themselves settlers in illegal settlements. And so Israel has moved from, seeing the settlement project as, something that's supported by the state, but can be controlled by the state, to something that is now within the state and to some extent is the driving force of the state. This has been the case increasingly in recent years.
Right. On July 17th, Israeli ground forces invaded Gaza again, which Israel says is to shut down the tunnels that Hamas could use to cross into Israel. How will this impact cross-country trade?
I mean, I don't think that specific episode had that much impact. But Israel's attacks on Gaza are constant, sometimes because a rocket is fired, sometimes by some tiny dissident group. And that has an impact. The closures always have an impact. Every time that the limited outlets for Gaza, whether towards Egypt or more importantly towards Israel, are shut down by the Israelis, what they're essentially doing is punishing the civilian population for what they claim Hamas or other groups are responsible for. And this can have a devastating effect on people going to seek medical treatment, people trying to go abroad to study, obviously on trade and commerce.
Right. So Israel has these successful security programs where they conduct successful drills. Do these really add fuel to the fire or enable a sense of apathy?
No, I don't think they add fuel to the fire. I mean, Israel has been successful in protecting its population, which is what any state should do. And I don't think that there's anything bad one can say about that. No, I don't think so. I mean, when we were living in Lebanon, we helped to dig. When we opened an early childhood center in Tel Zatar camp, which was encircled during the Lebanese Civil War and was later subjected to bombardment, siege, and eventually the camp was destroyed and there was a massacre in which a couple of thousand people were killed. Before that happened, we had been working there, and we started the building of a shelter because the parents said, we don't want our children to be going to this nursery school and not be able, if should there be fighting, to take refuge. And so we helped them dig a shelter. And I don't see anything wrong with those kinds of things. On the contrary, every political authority has the responsibility to protect its population.
In your most recent book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, you discuss Washington's favoritism to Israel over Palestine. I would like to discuss the United States' historical involvement in the region and how that's impacted not only Israel and Palestine, but how the world then sees these two states based on that history of the United States.
Yeah, that's a good question, Erin. In fact, I think the United States has reprised the role that Britain played, pretending to be an objective arbiter, pretending to be adjudicating fairly between the two sides, but in fact putting its big fat thumb on the scale in favor of one side and against the other. One of the lead negotiators in the State Department during the period I was involved in negotiations and before and after was a professional State Department official by the name of Aaron David Miller. And he wrote in a book of his that the United States never operated as a disinterested broker. In fact, it operated, he said, as Israel's lawyer. And I think that's absolutely correct. The United States has operated as Israel's lawyer. It has advocated for and it has negotiated on behalf of Israel and has operated as an ally in negotiations rather than as an intermediary between the two sides. On the basis of a 1975 memorandum, the secret memorandum that Kissinger arrived at with the Israeli government, the United States agreed to send anything it was going to say about Palestine to Israel for pre-approval. So these became American-Israeli positions rather than American positions. The United States never said anything that the Israelis didn't approve of, had prior approval of. So I think that, and Britain was equally biased in favor of the Zionist movement, certainly up to 1939. That changed for a few years at the end of the British Mandate, but for the first 22 years, that was the case. And it has been the case with some exceptions for the United States. In fact, it's increased, I would argue. It was less the case in the 50s and into the early 60s than it has become since the 60s. And I think that has both helped Israel and frankly hindered Israel, because I think people realize and have increasingly realized the United States is not unbiased in this. The United States, I've argued, if there's ever another negotiation, I say this in my last book, if there's ever another negotiation, there's no question but that the United States has to be there. The United States is the sole superpower. The United States is the major Middle Eastern power. But it should be there sitting on the side of the table with Israel. It's not an independent party. It's tied to the Israelis by agreements, by understandings, by all kinds of political and other links, and cannot separate itself from the Israeli position. And so, yeah, it has to be there. But on the other side, as enemies of the Palestinians, because I think that the United States has not just operated as Israel's lawyer, it's operated as Israel's banker, it's operated as Israel's armory. Most of what Israel has done since the 70s, at least, or the late 60s, has been done with American weaponry on the battlefield, whether against the Palestinians or against Arab countries. All of the top-of-the-line weaponry in Israel's arsenal, Israel produces a vast array of its own military equipment, tanks, all kinds of stuff, small arms. But the top-of-the-line stuff, the F-35s, the F-15s, the F-16s, those are American, as is a variety of other top-of-the-line weaponry. And Israel is the only country that gets some of this stuff. So the United States has armed Israel, the United States funds Israel, the United States defends Israel diplomatically and is its lawyer. And so it's obviously not an unbiased party in this. It is a party to the conflict and has played a role. I've argued it has prevented peace between Palestine and Israel. The American position has not facilitated it. The United States argues we're a peacemaker. And that's certainly true as between Egypt and Israel. And to a lesser extent, it was true between Jordan and Israel. Those were both actions that were mainly in American strategic interest, which is why they did it. But as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the Palestine issue is concerned, the United States has never seen it as particularly important, and it's never therefore been willing to put any pressure on Israel. No president is willing to expend the kind of political capital that they were willing to expend to get peace between Egypt and Israel, for example, for reasons of American national interest, or that they were willing, as President Obama was, to go against ferocious Israeli opposition in order to negotiate the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. So on some issues, the United States is willing to go toe-to-toe with Israel, but not on Palestine.
Right. And I do want to keep talking about the U.S., especially the current administration's involvement in regards to Palestine and Israel. But before I do, I also think that something that we should make clear for our viewers here is not only how those two states and the United States might be affected, but how that whole region, kind of, you were touching on Egypt and Jordan a moment ago, are affected. And that includes, Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans. In your book, you discuss quite a bit of that as well. And the countries surrounding this conflict zone. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. I actually want to comment on a specific aspect of that, which is the fact that there is an argument being made that the Arab countries or the Arab the Arabs is the way it's often put, are less interested in Palestine than they were previously, and that the kind of support that the Palestinians enjoyed from Arab public opinion has waned. In fact, there's a stubborn refusal to look at Arab public opinion. What people in Washington want to do is to look at the unelected tin pot dictators sustained by Washington and the unelected absolute monarchs sustained by Washington, who don't represent their people, who don't rule on the basis of consent of the governed, and who are not Democrats, and who are therefore miles away from public opinion. If you actually look at public opinion polls, which are done by a variety of reputable institutions in Qatar and Washington and everywhere, Arab public opinion is the same as it's always been. It's sympathetic to the Palestinians. Now, why does that not express itself? Firstly, because the Arab governments don't represent those people and therefore don't represent those views. And secondly, because many people in the Arab world have overwhelming problems that are more important to them than Palestine. If you live in Libya, a country that has been destroyed since American, British, and French intervention brought down the Gaddafi regime, and is the scene of a proxy war between 8 or 7 countries and a civil war, or Yemen, or Syria, or Iraq, you have bigger problems than Palestine. Your country almost doesn't exist. In the case of Yemen, you have the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. Palestine is more important than people starving and dying of COVID. It's not. There's just no question that if you're an Iraqi or a Syrian or a Yemeni or a Libyan, and those are countries in dire straits, you can't pay attention to this. And in many other countries where the regimes are contested by their people, like Algeria or Sudan, where there was a successful revolution to overthrow one military dictator, but where the military is still playing a big role, people have other concerns. And so Palestine is not in the forefront of people's minds as it was before, but they still have the same views on it. And you still have the same kinds of undemocratic, unrepresentative regimes, which are in many cases dependent on external support because they lack legitimacy, like the Gulf regimes, like these monarchies in the Gulf, these absolute monarchies in the Gulf, and who need the United States to protect them from their own people and from external enemies, and who therefore do what Washington wants. And Washington wants them to go to Tel Aviv. So they go to Tel Aviv. They also are afraid of Iran because they can't defend themselves and they think Israel will protect them. So there are multiple reasons why these unrepresentative, undemocratic regimes, which lack domestic legitimacy, should need external support and should ignore public opinion, whether in their own countries or in the Arab world as a whole. So, I mean, that's one set of regional effects that I think are well worth talking about. And they explain, for example, the normalization between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Israel. I wouldn't call them peace treaties because the countries were never at war. When those two countries became independent, Israel had been in existence for decades, and they were never at war with Israel. So they didn't make peace with Israel, but they did normalize their relations. And I think that's an explanation. I mean, in the case of Bahrain, you're talking about a country which had periods of democratic interludes, but where you have a monarchy which represents the Sunni minority imposing itself on the Shia majority with the support of external forces. When the Bahrainis rose up during the 2011 revolution, Saudi forces came in and reimposed the monarchy. This is not a representative government. This is not even an independent government. It's there because of Saudi bayonets. I mean, it's like talking about, you know, parts of the Ukraine that are there because the Soviet Union, Russia, Freudian slip. Russia has intervened. I mean, to what extent are they independent? They're not. The Bahraini government represents its Saudi and Emirati patrons, and is there in spite of the wishes of its own people. So, you know, what the Bahrainis do with Israel represents a tiny elite that's unrepresentative of its own people.
Right. And just a moment ago, you mentioned how Palestine isn't really in the forefront because based on the, you know, current state of other countries, especially with COVID and everything happening, it isn't on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. However, recently, the U.S. Secretary of State visited Israel and became the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit an Israeli settlement. Right. That got a lot of news. This is an obvious bias to a lot of onlookers worldwide. How do you believe that this recent development between the Trump administration and the state of Israel will impact future relations between the three countries?
Well, the Trump administration was trying to do two things. It was trying to move the goalposts so that they couldn't be moved back in terms of things like considering the occupied territories occupied, in terms of the American embassy being in Jerusalem, in terms of the settlements, the point that you just raised. But I think they were doing something else, which is pandering electorally to part of their base. The president ran essentially towards the right in this presidential election. He didn't try and expand his base. He went to the hardest, most committed of his own supporters. And I think that Secretary of State Pompeo was doing the same thing in preparation for a presidential run in 2024, playing to the hardline base of the right wing of the Republican Party, which is now controlling the party, rather than to independents or people in the middle. And for those people, he was basically feeding them red meat, going to a settlement, adopting a certain definition of anti-Semitism, which would outlaw boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements. Things like that are electorally determined as much as they're determined by principles. I'm not suggesting that Pompeo, or I don't know about Trump, but certainly Pompeo, I'm not suggesting he doesn't believe in what he's doing. I'm sure he does, but he's doing it partly out of political opportunism. As well as I said, trying to move the goalposts. And finally, trying to lay landmines for the Biden administration, trying to prevent them from doing things vis-a-vis Iran, trying to prevent them from doing things vis-a-vis settlements, or vis-a-vis BDS, or vis-a-vis other issues, sensitive issues, by creating complex problems that'll be very difficult to unravel for the Biden administration.
Right. You just touched upon the question I was about to ask you next. With the change of the presidential administration upon us here in the United States, how do you think that's going to impact not only the U.S., how Biden's going to have to deal with this, but the future of Palestine and Israel?
Right. Well, there's good news and there's bad news as far as the Middle East generally is concerned. The good news is that I think that the new administration will at least try to return to a path of negotiation with Iran rather than bullying and sanctions, and essentially trying to bring the regime down, which was the Trump endgame. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the whole region. It is true that there are diehard fanatics in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, and in the Emirates who really want a war with Iran. They want the United States to knock out Iran's capacities. They want the United States to get into an endless war with Iran. They want the United States to fight their war for them, because for them, Iran is a problem. And Iran is a problem for the region. I'm not suggesting that there's not a problem there. It's just that as the Obama administration stressed when it pushed the nuclear deal, the alternative is a war that will make Iraq and Afghanistan look like picnics. Iran is not an easy country to deal with. It's a country that has enormous power projection capabilities. It's a country whose regime is well entrenched. It's not going to collapse, and it will fight. So so-called surgical strikes are a fantasy. You take out the nuclear reactor, you're starting a war that may go on for decades. I mean, we're in the 20th, we're going into the 20th year of the Afghan war next year. It's still not over. Inshallah, I hope, I pray it will end. There are negotiations ongoing. We are now in the 17th year of the Iraq war. There's still American troops taking casualties in Iraq, and the Iraqis are still fighting. Starting a war with Iran is absolute folly. And that is something that is recognized by our armed services, the American armed services, that is recognized by the American intelligence community, that is recognized by the professionals at the State Department. It is not recognized by the fanatical ideologues that the president has appointed, people like Pompeo. I mean, I believe they want, I don't know what they want. Maybe it's something eschatological having to do with their understanding of, the end of days. Or it just may be blind stupidity, not understanding that you start a war with Iran and it'll never end. Though actually Pompeo is reported to have been one of the people resisting the president when the president suggested a strike on Iran a couple of weeks ago. So the good news is firstly, I think that the new administration will try and change at least the tone and reestablish some form of negotiation with Iran, and may also crack down on the adventurous, aggressive foreign policies of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in places like Yemen and Libya. These two countries have been making war on neighboring countries in the case of Yemen, and on a country far away in the case of Libya. The Emirates is at war in Libya. It's hiring mercenaries. It has its air force there. It's spending huge amounts of money. In the case of Yemen, both countries have occupying forces in Yemen, and both countries are engaged or have been engaged in airstrikes on Yemen. They've killed enormous numbers of innocent civilians. The countries, they're starving as a result of a blockade. and they're suffering from COVID in a terrible way. Hopefully, the administration will do something about that. And finally, we'll do something about human rights in places like Egypt, which has an awful human rights situation, where you have an enormously repressive regime, completely undemocratic. And the same is true in Saudi Arabia, and the same is true in Bahrain, and the same is true in the Emirates. Hopefully, the administration will do something about it. The bad news is that even though I think they will pull back from some of the measures that the Trump administration took as regards Palestine, they'll probably reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem. They'll probably resume aid to UNRWA. They may do other things. I don't really see that they will do anything to change the fundamental American support for whatever Israel does. There's a lot of resentment among people in the Biden team towards the Netanyahu government and towards Netanyahu personally. He undermined the president that most of them worked for, President Obama. He systematically undermined him. He came to Washington and spoke at the behest of the Republican Party twice before joint sessions of Congress. The only person in American history who's spoken to a joint session of Congress more than once is Winston Churchill. So we have Winston Churchill and we have Benjamin Netanyahu, thanks to Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. And in so doing, he attacked the foreign policy of his host country, the foreign policy of the sitting president. I mean, it's unspeakable when you think about it for 2 minutes, that Americans should have invited a foreigner to attack their chief executive. It's revolting. And there's a lot of resentment against Netanyahu because of that. But there's a powerful pro-Israel wing, which is the dominant one in the leadership of the Democratic Party. And I don't think that's going to change. So I don't expect any fundamental changes in the American approach on Palestine.
Right. Touching on a very different topic, there's something called a price tag attack. Price tag actions do not really just target Palestinians, but they also target the IDF commanders. Do you think Israel might really bow down now on the price tag issue, or do you think this is just going to cause more violence?
Yeah, you're talking about attacks on Palestinians by settlers mainly in the occupied territories, in the occupied West Bank. That's a good question, and it's hard to say. There are a whole range of issues on which the administration could choose to slap the Netanyahu government's hand. This could be one of them. Another is barring entry of American citizens on the basis of their political views. I mean, the Israeli government treats Americans who support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or even some who don't, but who they claim do so, just prevents them from entering. The United States government, with just by moving its pinky, could stop that. Stop 5 Israeli generals from coming into the United States. Say, well, we consider there's a possibility you may have been responsible for human rights abuses, and we won't give you a visa. They wouldn't stop one American at Ben Gurion Airport if the United States had the guts to do that. And we have people, not just Arab Americans or Muslim Americans or Black Americans who are singled out, all of these groups. Brown and Black and Arab and Muslim Americans are singled out for harassment, systematic harassment going into and out of Israel. And many of them are denied entry if their political views are found to be incorrect in terms of what is real. And Israelis come to the United States by the hundreds of thousands without any hindrance. And Israeli public opinion would turn on a dime if one Israeli were turned back for political reasons. One. You'd only have to take one general, one official, one settlement leader, and subject that person to, you can't come in. And I'm sure. So there are multiple issues on which, should the Biden administration want to have a toe-to-toe with the Israelis, with this government, this Israeli government, it could do it. And price tags could be one of them.
Right. Violence in this region has pretty much become a status quo now. And even peace attempt talks are really sounding very risky. So how have the Palestinians and Israelis reacted to the peace offers?
Well, I think Israel has pretty much ignored Palestinian peace offers. What you get from the Israeli side is the Palestinians don't want peace. We have no partner for peace. Their demand, and if they even admit that the Palestinians have said anything in the way of making offers, they say they're unrealistic. I mean, I spent the better part of 2 years on and off as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in Washington, devising what we called a Palestinian interim self-government agreement, which would have given the Palestinians jurisdiction over most of the occupied territories. This is decades ago. This is in the early 90s. It was a non-starter as far as the Israelis are concerned. In 1988, the PLO made an offer. It was a non-starter as far as the Israelis were concerned. I have to say, I don't think that the Palestinians have been as forthcoming as they should have been in terms of stating clearly what they want, in terms of having a unified Palestinian position. The division in Palestinian politics in the last 15 years has been a disaster. So I don't think the Palestinians have been by any means as forthcoming as they could and should have been. But they subscribed to the Saudi peace offer of 2002, which is a two-state offer. Israel is not interested in two states. It's not interested in a sovereign, independent Palestinian state with control over its own borders, such that any sovereign state would have. This has never been on offer. Rabin, in his last speech, said he's not going to give the Palestinians that. Whatever Barak said at Camp David in 2000, it did not amount to that. Whatever Olmert said. So part of the problem is that Israeli peace offers have always been less than the minimum that the Palestinians can accept. There are people. They're entitled to self-determination. If the Jewish people are entitled to self-determination, so are the Palestinians. And that's not something that Israel has ever really been willing to accept. Real sovereignty, real independence, real statehood, which is why many Palestinians are now arguing we should argue for justice and equality. We should argue for some kind of binational setup where both peoples have self-determination, and however it's organized, that there be absolute equity, absolute equality, absolute justice, and some kind of democratic framework. Now, many Palestinians don't subscribe to that. Some do. Public opinion is shifting in that direction. But there are many problems with that, just as there are problems with the two-state solution. But that's the way things are going for many Palestinians.
Yeah. So what is your opinion on the future of these negotiations?
Well, I don't think that if negotiations resume on the previous basis, on the basis which have failed so far to bring about a resolution of this issue, that they will be successful. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. First of all, as I've already said, the United States is not an unbiased mediator. The United States is heavily biased, and that has tilted the negotiations in favor of the stronger party. And the weaker party, which is the Palestinians, are simply not willing to capitulate, which is all that Israel is willing, under this government, certainly to offer. The second thing is that you have an Israeli government which feels that it is on top of things. It's establishing relationships with repressive regimes all over the region, offering it an entree economically and politically in security terms and diplomatically. And there's no reason for it to compromise. It's suffering not at all from any kind of pressure from any direction. The Europeans are as limp and weak in spite of their bleating and protests about Israeli actions. They do nothing. They exert no pressure whatsoever on Israel. The United States, I would argue, under Biden is unlikely to do that. I mean, you had Democratic politicians, you had a presidential candidate, several of them, who said we will sanction Israel if it does certain things. Biden has emphatically stated he won't do any such thing. Therefore, Israel has impunity. It will continue to enjoy the impunity from at least the United States and probably Europe that it's always enjoyed. Finally, the Palestinians are deeply divided between an inept, corrupt, aged, blind, strategically bankrupt leadership in Ramallah and a narrow, weak, also weak leadership in Gaza with no strategic vision. And the two groups have no ability to come together. And when they begin to come together, the United States and Israel put pressure on them. So as soon as the Biden administration came into view, the possibility of a Biden, the possibility of an inter-Palestinian reconciliation disappeared because the Ramallah leadership under Abu Mazen, under Mahmoud Abbas, figured we'll go back to negotiations, and the United States don't want us to talk to Hamas, so we won't. So the Palestinians are in a situation of being weak and divided, and they don't have an agreed upon position. How do you go into negotiations without an agreed upon position? Abbas was elected so long ago that nobody even remembers. There's a whole generation that's grown up since this leadership appeared on the scene, or since it last had democratic validation. They don't represent any more than the Hamas leadership in Gaza represents. I mean, these are people who were elected to an assembly in 2006. That's 14 years ago. So the Palestinians are in a position where they are a much less than ideal position to enter negotiations. Israel is not willing to give anything in negotiations and won't be pressured to do so. The United States is unfit for the role of broker. And to be frank, I think the administration has bigger fish to fry than a fruitless negotiation between parties who are not going to compromise, not able for different reasons, not willing in the case of Israel, not able in the case of the Palestinians to compromise. They have the nuclear issue with Iran. They have wars in the region, and they have, major issues in terms of Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, Russia, relations with China, as well as the pandemic, the economy, and the constitutional crisis in this country, created by the Trump's refusal to recognize the results of the elections and to cast doubt on the entire democratic process. I mean, you're President Biden, and you say, there's 27 levels of importance before you get to Palestine. Unfortunately, or perhaps that it is what it is. As to how this thing might resolve itself, you probably want to ask that question next. I'm suggesting it's not going to resolve itself now as a result of any negotiation in the immediate future. That could change. I mean, the Palestinians could get together. The Netanyahu government could fall. The Biden administration could find a backbone where dealing with Israel is concerned. I don't think any of those things is necessarily going to happen, but they could. Other things could happen in the region, which will change the equation in some way. But I don't expect that in the short term. In the long term, I don't think you're going to have a solution unless it's based on justice and equality. I think, though, if one group of people say, our people can come here and yours can't, that's not going to fly. If you have one group of people saying, we are entitled to certain kinds of property and you're not, that's not going to fly. Our security is more important than your security, or even worse, our security is at the expense of your insecurity. So in order for us to feel secure, hundreds of thousands of your people have to suffer at checkpoints. It's not going to fly. That's not a basis for a sustainable, just, equitable solution. How you get from this unjust, inequitable status quo, which is a one-state status quo. There is one state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and that's the state of Israel. There's one sovereign authority, there's one security authority. The illusion that the mistake that the PLO made in 1993 was to give people the illusion that there was a potential Palestinian state in the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority could not have been, given Israel's position and its actions, the embryo of a Palestinian state. The most that it could be was a subordinate authority to carry out Israel's wishes. And that's what it's done. You have one authority, one sovereign. There's one population register. It's controlled by Israel. There's one entry authority, one exit authority, one import authority, one currency. I mean, any attribute of sovereignty attaches to Israel. Airspace, Israel. Groundwater, Israel. Archaeology below the ground, Israel. I mean, one can go through every aspect of sovereignty. Israel has everything. But there are several sets of rights within that country. Israeli Jews have one set of rights. You could even argue Ashkenazi Jews have more privileges in certain respects than Mizrahi Jews. But in any case, Israeli Jews, Israeli citizens who are Arabs have less rights. And then you have the various categories of Palestinians living under military occupation with almost no rights whatsoever. And that's not a situation that's tenable. It's different too, but in many ways I would argue worse than Jim Crow segregation, and different too, but in many ways worse than apartheid. I resist describing it as apartheid because apartheid had aspects. South Africans who go to Palestine say this is much worse than anything we went through. And so it is a situation of systematic discrimination, and that can't stand in the 21st century. You could do that kind of thing in the 18th century. You could say Native Americans don't get this and we get that. You could say that in the 19th century. Asians, Africans, whatever, don't get this, we get that. You can't say that in the 21st century. So I think that until you are in a situation where everybody enjoys equal rights and one group, it doesn't have elevated privilege at the expense of another group, you're not going to have a solution.
I want to take a moment just to thank you so much for joining us here today and offering us your very valuable time. We appreciate it so much. And Afia and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.
I hope so.